Zero risk, maximum returns. Mastering stock market linked investments. Available on Amazon, paperback and Kindle. See info below in video description. Book provided by the author, Brooke Lunsford.
The land known as the Holy Land is the birthplace of three of the world's principal religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and has been a contested area since 1200 BC. The original inhabitants, the Canaanites and Philistines, were conquered in 1000 BC by the Jews, who remained sovereign for about 300 years. For the next 1500 years, a series of conquest and occupations left a residual Jewish population in the area of less than 20%, the rest being predominantly Muslim and Christian Arabs. During the 1800s, a nationalist movement among the Jews in diaspora emerged in response to persecution. These Jews, known as Zionists, sought to re-establish Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. During World War I, the major imperial powers, including Britain, France, and Russia, were allied against Germany and Turkey and vied for control of the Middle East and its newly discovered oil fields. The Zionists skillfully played off the need for the support of the Jewish communities in each of these nations for the war effort, in order to get backing for their settlements in Palestine.
Zionism initially, you see, is a secular movement. In Zionism, when you have the state of Israel created, it's a secular state. Zionism comes out of people who broke away from religious Judaism in Eastern Europe and realized they could not get assimilation into European culture in Russia because of all the anti-Semitism, unlike what was going on in Western Europe. And they needed a country where they could call their own. And so they looked back to where they had been 2,000 years before. And so once they began to get backing from individuals, philanthropists, the Rothschilds of Paris particularly, they were able to begin something. You have one wave, the first Aliyah, and then you have a second in 1905 where David Ben-Gurion comes over. And these people were highly militant. And they criticized the first wave, because the first wave came over, and while they purchased land, absentee landowners, by the way, not Palestinians, who had bought up the land of the 19th century, they did not expel the Palestinians. They used them to work. And as labor. And when you had the militant Zionists, who were very close to communism, far right, far left wing, hardline people, came in, they said only Jewish labor can build a new Israel, and you cannot have Palestinian labor, you say. So they're very critical of this. And at the same time, they were quite open about their objectives. So the Palestinians were very aware of this, you say, and very aware of Zionist objectives, and Zionists were quite willing and aware to confront and take on Palestinian objection. We really don't know what would have happened. Zionism might not have gone anywhere except for World War I. And then in World War I, when you have this conflict that includes the Middle East, you have the imperial powers allied, Britain and France, with Russia, who had often been at odds, totally at odds, during most of the 19th century, quite often over the scramble for power, the scramble for territories in Africa, as well as Southeast Asia. You have this tremendous explosion. This wasn't the beginning of imperialism, but it was the real push, we might say, and much more occupation, particularly by France in North Africa. Well, what many people don't know is that in World War I, your subjects from these colonies or areas that you controlled, you had them fighting for you in Europe, not just in the Middle East. You had tens of thousands of Indians fighting there, etc. Many Muslims. The French had many people from North Africa. They had people from West Africa, Senegal, etc., all in the trenches. You say, you want them happy. You don't want them opposed to you. And they're very worried about Muslims, particularly responding to this caliphal call for holy war against the British, French, and Russians. So you want to get an Arab leader to revolt, and there had been a lot of contact with the Sharif Hussein of Mecca before. So finally you get this correspondence from the last 5 months of 1915, in which it appears that the British have promised independence in many areas, with only certain areas excluded, and that these include from Hussein's point of view, he asked for it, Palestine as well as Syria, with Iraq having certain special qualifications because the British wanted to go in there to protect oil in the Persian Gulf. And Hussein had agreed with this. Well, technically, Palestine was never included in the final version of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, but the British had no intention of living up to any of it because they'd already had the French promise for Syria, and so they were very vague about what might be excluded, subject to the interests of our ally France. Hussein agreed with this, and what was subject to the interests of our ally France was all of Syria, which then, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, the Anglo-French Agreement was awarded as a sphere of influence or control, Syria and Lebanon, to France, and the British got control of Iraq. Palestine was to be neutral. Then Zionism comes along again because the leader of Zionism is in Britain. Chaim Weizmann has many close ties with British statesmen, and they want a declaration promising Palestine to them. And it's finally made in November of 1917 for wartime reasons. Weizmann has many close ties with British statesmen, and they want a declaration promising Palestine to them. And it's finally made in November of 1917 for wartime reasons, because by this time the Russians were about to collapse. You had one revolution in March, and now you're going to have a second one in November where the Bolsheviks come in. You're trying to forestall that, and if Russia goes out of the war, you're terrified, because Germany can then put all its troops against you and France on the Western Front. The United States isn't in there yet. And so, while there was a great deal of sympathy in the David Lloyd George government, and Arthur Balfour was the foreign minister for Zionism, wartime expediency played a major role, because the argument was, the way it was presented by Weizmann and people, was that if you promise Palestine to the Jewish people as a national home, then you get so many Bolsheviks who are Jews, they'll be totally sympathetic and they'll stay in the war. Conversely, there are many Americans who want to see this, and this may influence Woodrow Wilson to actually commit troops, because Wilson had committed the United States to the war much earlier, but troops had not really come in, you see. And as a matter of fact, it had no influence, but troops did begin coming in January and February of 1918, and without them, Germany might have won the war in the major offensive that happened in March. Here you have the victorious powers coming together. And one of the deals after the war was that the victors could take all the colonial possessions of the losers. So there's this gradual parceling out between the British, French, and the Japanese particularly, of these lands. And how do you justify this? Because Woodrow Wilson really opposed this. He said his 14 points, of course, of January 1918, the wishes of the inhabitants of a country should be considered as the primary concern. If we're allowing European rulers to come in, if they're not going to be independent, then the will of the population must be considered. So it can't be colonies. And so you created the idea of mandates. And a mandate meant that anyone who took over a territory, new or otherwise, and say Palestine, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, which had never existed as countries before, are now divided up. And they become countries, and they become mandatories of France and Britain. And the way you get around the idea of colonial spoils and all that is to say the mandate obligates you to prepare the inhabitants of these countries for self-government at some time in the future. But then Palestine became a special case because the British violated the provisions of the mandate for Palestine, because they put the Balfour Declaration into the Palestine mandate, you see. What did this mean? It meant that for Palestine, the wishes of the inhabitants, 90% Arab, would not be listened to, and they would not be developed for independence. It would be Jews, once they came in through immigration, you see, they would be allowed to develop. And so it's really with the Palestinian mandate and the violation of the mandatory provisions to give the Zionists the right to create a majority of Jews to create a Palestinian state that the real Palestinian Zionist conflict begins, with very few illusions on both sides. And the Zionists themselves knew quite well that the Palestinians had national identity, and they were fighting, and Jabotinsky, Vladimir Jabotinsky was head of the right-wing revisionist party, Likud is that today. They wanted to control Jordan as well, Transjordan at the time. Forget just the West Bank. But he said, look, ladies and gentlemen, he said in 1921, he said, I've never heard of any people welcoming the people who are going to conquer them and take them over and deprive them of their land. We're going to have to fight them. And his idea was that this would be an iron wall, that you had to impose your will on Arabs, the Palestinians, to show them that you are all powerful, and ultimately they will submit. So the Zionist attitude was that you were going to have to crush the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians really didn't have very much power. They couldn't get any money in from outside. The labor Zionists, the official Zionist movement, people don't know this, was not the most powerful movement in Palestine, even though it was the official representative to Britain of Zionism. Chaim Weizmann in London, Ben Gurion in Palestine. But the major investment in Palestine was by independent Jewish investors. The Americans, Judge Brandeis, Louis Brandeis leading them, broke away from Zionism, labor Zionism, because they didn't want socialism and didn't want to be controlled. So it was really private investment more than anything else, not this socialist labor Zionism, that got most of the land that you actually bought, which was, by 1948, still only 1/3 of the land. And Palestinians was still 2/3 of the population. When Hitler comes to power in 1933, you begin to have a situation, and everyone knows what Hitler is about, and when he comes in, you begin to get, of course, anti-Jewish laws, racist laws, forbidding marriage with Aryans and things like this, and then it gets worse, you're barred from employment, and even before you really get the major persecution that's going to come in the later 30s, although the camps, the concentration camps, were really built for political opponents, mainly Catholics, and some Protestant, not for Jews. They were put in there later on after 1941. But you begin to get Jews looking at this and saying, where can we go? And the Nazis are trying to encourage them to go. And there's actually an arrangement made with Zionists in Palestine so that German Jews who want to go can go to Palestine and have the equivalent of their wealth, they're leaving their property behind, transferred so that they get the value of their possessions in Palestine, you see. And so suddenly, in 1933 to 1936-37, you almost triple the Jewish population of Palestine because of these events in Europe. And the wealth that comes over is very significant because this influx, and some of it's from anti-Semitism against Jews in Poland as well during the time, is able to build an infrastructure, an industrial infrastructure that you've never had before. You get a middle class, upper middle class people with money to invest. You get new industries, which are not going to affect the Palestinian Arabs. They're totally separate from it. And this is quite a different class of people than the penniless workers who were coming over in the 20s that the labor Zionists were bringing over. So it transforms things. And with many other issues that are going on, it ultimately leads to an Arab revolt that is going to happen from 1936 and will not be fully crushed until 1939. And this is an Arab revolt. In part it is despair against what is seen suddenly. You know, the Jewish presence hasn't been that much before, but now suddenly you're getting a very large Jewish presence. So you seem to be losing ground in this way. You become aware, some of you, that your leadership may have been, some of it, selling land to Zionists. You have increasing expulsion from lands that are bought, because the idea of Jewish labor meant also that this was inalienable Jewish land. And that meant that once Jews bought land, it could never be sold to a non-Jew. And Arabs living on the land would be thrown off. And so while the percentage is not that large, it is, several thousand people who are going into shanty towns around the cities, Haifa, Jaffa, etc., in the 30s. And so there's a displaced class of people here as well. And there's growing resentment as what is seen as the inability of the Palestinian leadership to oppose this in any form whatsoever. And so you ultimately get this revolt that is sparked actually by, it's interesting, this man, Sheikh Izzeddin al-Qassam, There's a Qassam brigade in Hamas today. A Muslim preacher who had been ministering to these displaced workers and saying around in the shanty towns and saying that Islam is the only way you'll have any pride because you're being, displaced, you have no property, you're homeless, etc., etc. And so the revolt explodes, dies down for a bit, and the British come in and propose a partition of Palestine in the Peel Commission report of 1937. And it's in reaction to that you get the real explosion of the Arab revolt from later 1937 with the major casualties down to early 1939. And at one point, the Palestinian rebels controlled most of Palestine, in the hinterland, not the cities. And the British are unable to do very much because, particularly in 1938, because of tensions in Europe, Hitler, Czechoslovakia, etc. Now, the Jewish state was quite small, and it followed more or less the land holdings in the northwest, essentially, and northern parts of Palestine. It was only about 25% of Palestine. But it had the wealthiest land. And it also had an equal population of Arabs who would have to leave. You'd have forcible transfer. Presumably they'd be reimbursed, but they had been there first, and they had developed the citrus industry there long before the Zionists came in. So there was that sense of injustice. Then, although the Arabs got more land, there was also this sense that there was no Palestinian state, because the way the British proposed it, this is a little complicated, the state was to include Transjordan, you see, which had been created in 1921 and given to one of the sons of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the Emir. Abdullah had been very interested in aligning himself to Zionists and moderate Palestinians to get Jewish investment in Transjordan, because economically it was a basket case. And so he was very close to the British. So when the Peel Commission report comes in, the Palestinian Arab area is going to be part of Transjordan, with Abdullah, who's an Arab from the Hijaz, the Red Sea part of Arabia, as ruler. It's not going to be a Palestinian state, whereas the Zionists, the Jews, are going to get a Jewish state, you see. So the Arabs are opposed to this from the beginning, in part because they're simply not going to rule, you see, and also because they see that the land they're getting, although it's much more, is of much less value. The Zionists were upset because they wanted more land, you see, because after all, let's face it, Hitler's aims are quite clear at this point. And on the one hand, the Zionist leadership wants to get any state so that they can control it and take in as many people as they can, you see. But the majority of Zionists initially opposed this, and finally Ben Gurion persuaded them, look, go along with this and we'll see if we can get more land out of this. Well, this never came to fruition simply because the British Foreign Office said, we don't want an independent state of anyone in Palestine because World War II is coming. There's going to be war in the Mediterranean and Europe. And if we have independent leaders there, we won't be able to act. So they put the kibosh on the whole deal. But one thing that the Zionist leadership did assure its following of at the time was, look, we can accept the state in a small area now, and we'll simply expand later on. And they actually did this in 1948. The Zionists were never committed to the boundaries of the partition with the Palestinian area. You say they never were. They assumed that at some point they might be able to take more land and expand. And so the Arabs in part rebelled against that, as well as against their own leaders. And it turned into a bloodbath in which then Palestinians were turning against each other. And the British were aligned with the Zionists in terms of crushing it. And once you thought you had peace in Europe after the Munich agreements, when Chamberlain came back in October 1938, we have peace for our time, then the British were able to send a lot of troops and armored cars over to Palestine and crush the Arab revolt. Now, ironically, as soon as they did that, they then turned around in a very cynical deal and undermined their commitment to the Zionists. In a 1939 white paper that came out in May, but they've been planning this for a while. Because here they are looking at, ensuing war, which is coming ever closer. And they're saying, well, the Arab countries surrounding Palestine are getting increasingly upset at what's going on in Palestine. And it's safe to say that up to that time of the Arab revolt in 1936, you had not had any major concern. You had delegations from Arab states, but keep in mind they were all occupied by Europeans. The French were in Syria and Lebanon. Iraq had become independent in 1932, but with a deal for British air bases and things. But nonetheless, it was much more independent. Egypt was under the control of the British. So, but once you had this Arab revolt, then Islamic elements in Egypt, particularly, begin to call attention to what's going on. This is the Muslim Brotherhood that had been founded in 1929 by Hassan al-Banna. And they defined this as Islamic land, Muslim land. And they shamed the government into calling conferences, you see, to become more concerned. And so it's only from that time that you begin to get people, Arabs in other areas, really committed and starting to donate, though there's not much you can do. Well, the British are looking at this, and they're looking at the war coming up, and you have Italy and Libya, right? And you assume you'll be fighting against Mussolini. And you have the French in North Africa, but you're worried more about Egypt and the Suez Canal, which is the major thing. Well, what if you begin fighting, and you're fighting the Italians in Libya, and you have a major Arab uprising behind you, not just in Egypt, which almost happened, by the way, in Egypt 1942, but also elsewhere, behind your backs. So you have a situation then where, how are we going to keep these people quiet? Because these Arab delegations are getting really angry because their populations are getting angry. We've got to promise them something. So in the White Paper of 1939, you actually say that the Balfour Declaration was never intended to create a Jewish state against the will of the Palestinian Arabs. Well, that's nonsense. You know, it was. They were never consulted. But you're now saying this, and as a result, you're saying that you are going to stop Jewish immigration. It's going to be very limited, 5,000 a year for 5 years. 15,000 a year for 5 years, up to 75,000. You're stopping land sales, because this is the other major friction, immigration and land sales. And in 10 years, this is said arbitrarily, you will negotiate with the Arabs and the Zionists about what type of state, and if they can't agree, then you will, the British, unilaterally impose a solution. Now, what that would mean was a state in Palestine that was 2/3 Arab and 1/3 Jewish. See what I mean? No Israel, no Jewish state in Palestine. So you were doing this not out of sympathy for the Palestinian Arabs. You could care less about them. You just crushed them. You killed an awful lot of them. You were worried about your Arab rulers and these states around and uprisings that might divert attention and troops from what you were going to do elsewhere. Well, the Zionists were infuriated, but they had no choice. You see, they had to go along with this, and Ben-Gurion said, well, fight the white paper as if there's no war. Well, we'll fight the war as if there's no white paper. Initially, we'll cooperate, and then we'll fight the white paper as if there's no war. We'll fight the war first, forget the white paper, then we'll fight the British and the white paper. And so once the threat towards Egypt and the Suez Canal receded with the Battle of El Alamein late in 1942, and the British began pushing the Germans, who'd come in, of course, Rommel and the Africa Corps, back to Tunisia. From 1943 on, Zionists in Palestine, with allies in the British Army and Zionists in Egypt, began stealing arms from the British to prepare for war against the British after the war was over. And they also had many people who fought with the British Army in Europe. But these people retained their ties to their superiors in the Haganah, the Jewish defense groups, and they were prepared then to align and to use their training against the British after the war if this was deemed necessary. At this time then, once you get the horror of the Holocaust being known, and that, the Zionists then have an excellent case to claim that because of what happened to the Jewish people, it is all the more necessary to have a haven for them that can only be a state of Israel. And the Palestinian Arabs, being legalists, are saying that we're not responsible for the Holocaust. We oppose that, we condemn that, but we also resist, the developments that the Zionists are claiming they have a right to have, namely to have a state. And you begin then to have this whole period from 1945 to 48 in which the United States plays an increasingly important role. This had begun in 1942 in the Biltmore program. There was a meeting at the Biltmore Hotel in May of 42 where the Zionists met to try and mobilize support among American Zionists, because most American Jews were not committed Zionists. And you wanted to arouse them also to the horrors of what was going on and try to push the Roosevelt administration to do something also about the atrocities in Europe and maybe do something about the camps. This did not happen. But this also led to a major split within Zionism because Chaim Weizmann was still in England and he wanted to negotiate vis-a-vis the British. Ben-Gurion was saying, he was based in Palestine, but he had come to this meeting in New York, forget the British. It's facts on the ground, and we're going to mobilize opinion in the United States against the British if necessary in order to do this. And the history is very complicated from 1945 to 48, but essentially the British are so weakened by World War II. People don't realize this, that they wound up much worse off, finally, than the French, the Italians, and the Germans, because we gave those people a Marshall Plan to develop their economies to stop the appeal of communism. You see what I mean? And we rebuilt Japan for anti-communist reasons. But the British economy remained terribly weak well into the 1960s. And in the winter of 46, 47, gas, you couldn't buy gas for cars for 6 months. And the winter was so bad that people froze in their homes because there was not enough coal. And the British were still trying to maintain their empire. But you also were so frustrated with Zionist resistance and terrorist attacks against the British. And the United States, Truman, for sometimes domestic political reasons, was, making statements favorable to Zionism, infuriating the British. Well, as a result of all of this, in William Roger Lewis's term, the Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin of Great Britain, hurled Palestine into the United Nations. Technically, they still had the mandate, and they said they will withdraw in 48, but they were no longer responsible for it. The United Nations sent a committee to evaluate this in the summer of 47, and they recommended partition. And the Zionists eagerly accepted this, and the Palestinian Arabs didn't because they were still 2/3 of the population, and they felt this was unjust. Now, you can argue what you want about whether they should have, all their fault, and certainly the Israelis have said ever since that the Palestinians never lost an opportunity to never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But a lot of powers, including Israel, have quite to make quite sure at times that the Palestinians would miss that opportunity. The conditions would be such that they would feel they had no choice but to reject something. But nonetheless, this partition, which was approved in the UN after Thanksgiving in 1947, officially recognized two states, Palestine and Israel, to be declared, within 6 months.
Popular sympathy for a Jewish state had been growing, and when David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, he knew that he had the backing of many governments, including the Soviet Union. But Israel's claim to sovereignty was immediately challenged by the surrounding Arab states, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. And within 24 hours, the ongoing border skirmishes became a full-scale war. The battle was hard-fought in some areas, such as Lod, but the Arab armies were no match for the Israelis. The Jewish militia, the Haganah, quickly defeated the various Arab forces that stood in their way as thousands of terrified Palestinians fled their villages or were forcibly removed by the advancing Israelis.
It's at this time, then, that you really get what we could call a civil war, and between Palestinians and the Zionists, who had much better organization, not quite as much manpower then, but by the spring they were much better off. And one of the myths of this whole period is that you had a little Israel, small Zionists against the Palestinians, and then later on in the war, when the Arab states invaded, that it was David versus Goliath. They were facing overwhelming odds. And this is simply not true, because even then Israel, from May of 48 on, had more troops than the Arab states, who had very small armies. See what I mean? So, but that's one of those things that many people believe. One of the other arguments that has come down, which has now been refuted by Benny Morris in the second edition of his book on the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem, was that the Arab states called for the Palestinians to flee in the spring of 48. There's no evidence of that. What really did happen was many and this is unfortunate for the Palestinians, they had no central leadership. And you had some bands from outside of irregulars who were doing most of the fighting, but there was no organization and tremendous divisiveness because these groups were controlled by Egypt, or Abdullah of Transjordan, etc. You had no unified leadership. And the Zionists had a nucleus of very good fighters and a much better command structure and leadership. And finally, in March, they began a push to ensure their control of areas that would become Israel under the partition. And as that happened, you began to get many more Palestinian Arabs fleeing, particularly after a massacre at a place called Deir Yassin, although people now think it was probably somewhat over 100, but not 200. But Begin and the Irgun and the Stern gang, Yitzhak Shamir was part of that. There was a combined attack in this Palestinian village that massacred many people. And the Palestinians did carry out a retaliatory raid, killing about 70 Jewish doctors on the road to Jerusalem shortly thereafter. But after that, you had mobile radio bands that Begin put into play, threatening more Deir Yassins if the Arabs didn't flee. In other words, you'll be massacred just like Deir Yassin. So it became part of the propaganda. And ultimately, as there's a lot of film of this, people just fled. And in one case, the mayor of Haifa, a Jewish mayor, asked people to stay, but in most cases, nobody didn't. And as Benny Morris now shows out, people were strongly encouraged to leave. There were atrocities on both sides, but people were raped, people were shot, period. And about half the people fled or were forced to leave before Israeli independence. And then when you had the Arab wars, the Arab invasion and the Arab state wars in June and July of 1948, you had the deliberate expulsion of 300 more thousand. Rabin was involved in this, and Lida and Ramla. And this is where you get a major influx of people going to what we call the West Bank. And you therefore have the armistice that's set up in 1949 that sets up lines, but an armistice means the state of war still exists. You see what I mean? So technically nothing has been settled. So you have two conflicting narratives, shall we say, as to how to interpret this. And these narratives and the conflicts in them come down to the present day, because most people, including people in the West and in Europe and the United States, if you study Middle East history, you study Middle East history. And that's true, although with variations in the Arab world or elsewhere. In Israel, however, the curricula has the history of the Jews being entirely separate from any history of Europe or the Middle East or anything else. So if you study Middle East history, it's not that, it's the Arab world and Africa. You say, Israel's not in it. So, and this is not necessarily true for Israeli scholars, but it is true for many people that their whole history in Israel of Zionism is distinct from anything that happened in the Middle East, you say. But for the average person, it's very easy if you have a system like this to fall into the trap of looking at this totally in terms of reacting to injustice. And this became all the more understandable because of the Holocaust, which nothing was deserved. So why did this happen, you say? So this also creates a mindset that if the Arabs are doing this, how could they do this to us? Look what happened to us here, etc. That's understandable. It's also understandable for Arabs to look at Israel, however small it was, as a much more powerful country than they were, which they did from the beginning. They feared Israel, regardless of how people over here looked at this in terms of geography and territory, etc. And they had a right to fear it. Israelis were Europeans. Technologically, they were way ahead. They brought technology with them. They were superior in all of this militarily to Arabs. And this came out in the 48 war, and I might explain some things that occurred at this time, how the division occurred, because when you had the Arab state invasion, Egypt, Syria, you had Iraqi troops, you had some Saudi, the Lebanese did very little, and you had the Transjordanians. This will become Jordan, which includes the West Bank after 1948. Well, when they invaded, there was no coordination, because no one trusted Abdullah of Transjordan, because he had been dealing with the Zionists in sort of what we might call a non-aggression pact. Although many Israeli historians deny this vociferously, there clearly were discussions and agreements. And although maps show that when you have this attack, you have what we call a Transjordanian attack against Israel, in fact, there was really no attack per se. They were holding on to positions in the West Bank, but where you did have conflict was over Jerusalem. But the Israelis were able, the Zionists, well, they were Israelis after May 14th. When they were confronting the Egyptians, for example, or other people, they really didn't have to worry about their backs in terms of where the Jordanians were, because the Jordanians weren't going to attack them. You see what I mean? So if you'd actually had a coordinated attack, it might have been quite different. But what Abdullah wanted to do, essentially, was to get that land, or a lot of it, that he'd been promised in the 1937 Peel Commission report. Remember, he's going to get part of Palestine, and they're going to be part of Transjordan. They're not going to have their own state. And there had been a tacit alliance between the Zionists and the Transjordanian leadership all along to deny the Palestinians a state. They divided up among themselves. And this was always the case. As a matter of fact, Jordanian history until the 1990s was pretty much that way, to deny Palestinians any opportunity of recognition as a people with a right to a state. So in the fighting that occurs then, the Israelis are able to hold back the Egyptians and ultimately to be successful. And you do have this fierce battle for Jerusalem, which will then be divided, with Western Jerusalem, the more European quarter, becoming Israel, and then divided, and then the old city, which is only about a quarter of a mile in area, would be Jordanian. Now, so you have this situation with, and which is going to last until the 1967 war. And from Israel's point of view, it has become secure, but on the other hand, there is great insecurity, because many of the Palestinians who have been dispossessed are in the West Bank, and the West Bank could be from here to the house next door in terms of where you are, and you're looking at people who are now farming your land, Jews, etc. First of all, the major tensions for a lot of this period in the early 50s were on the Jordanian Israeli border. And while you did have some attacks aiming to try and kill Israelis, the vast majority were pilfering, stealing, etc. And they were by Palestinians coming in, or sometimes they're trying to sneak in to come back into Israel and try to blend in with Israeli Arabs. On one occasion, one of my favorite stories, some sheep were stolen, a ram and a few ewes, from Israel into the West Bank. And Moshe Dayan and Ben-Gurion's acolytes, other acolytes, wanted to have a military attack, retaliation, but Moshe Sharet, who was then the prime minister, refused. He said, why are we going to kill people for sheep? And ultimately, with UN intervention, the sheep were returned. They said that the ram was a little bit the worse for wear. Obviously, he'd been breeding some Palestinian sheep over on the West Bank, but it was done without any retaliation. But the basic attitude of Ben-Gurion, Dayan, Shimon Peres, very hardline at that time, was to retaliate and to prove how strong you were. And Dayan has admitted openly now that sometimes when they claimed they were reacting to, like, Palestinian assaults or intervention, quite often they were doing training missions where they would provoke the action in order to then get training in fighting the Jordanian army. So the Jordanians didn't institute this, the Israelis did. You had a crisis in Israeli political life in the early 50s, 53, 54, because Moshe Sharet, who had been prime minister, was much more cautious about using military retaliation and was more interested in negotiation or exchanges. And the Ben-Gurionists thought he was a coward. And what happened here, which has a lot to do with the Suez Crisis, is that in 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser had come to power in July of 52. He gained real control of Egypt in the spring of 54, and he finally gained the final victory for Egypt. He got the British to agree to withdraw from the Suez Canal zone, which was a 200 square mile area. It's not like some little strip. And this would happen by June of 56. Well, the British had many troops there, obviously, and you'd had a lot of fights and chaos and strife there, particularly in 50, 51, 52. So you have a situation where the British, there's a tremendous triumph for Nasser. And Israelis who are in the government, Sharet now is prime minister. Ben-Gurion is going into semi-retirement. not necessarily totally committed to it, and he's still in touch with all his people who are in the Sharet government. And people in the administration, the Israeli government, decide that they will activate a spy ring in Egypt to put off bombs to make people think that the Egyptians are incapable of protecting foreigners. That way the British will stay and keep their troops in the Suez Canal. See what I mean? Now, this is a cockeyed idea. What's even worse about it is that it was done without Sharet's knowledge. It was done behind the back of the prime minister by people who are these hard right-wing guys. And they were caught, the people in Egypt. And they were thrown into jail. There were trials. 2 were hung, etc., etc. But the Israeli public all thought along that this was a lie. The Egyptians were lying. There was no ring. Why? Because Sharet, once he discovered, couldn't admit that he didn't know about it, that this was done behind his back. So you create this image of this persecutor Nasser operating with no justification. See, when in fact, you'd had the spy ring all along, and Sharet couldn't admit that he hadn't known about it. This did not come out until 1960. So this begins tensions, and the Israelis are very upset, and the public is very upset. There seems to be a threat from Egypt here. Ben Gurion comes in back in February of 55 as Minister of Defense. He tells Sharet to stay out of the way. You have a major retaliation against Egyptians in the Gaza Strip. 40 or 50 are killed, and this is going to set off an arms race that will ultimately be a major factor in the Suez crisis. Part of this, see, is not just Arab-Israeli stuff. It's, in this case, Israeli domestic politics and people going behind the back of their prime minister and not admitting it. So he has to go along so he doesn't make the Israelis think that they're leaderless, you know what I mean? Now, in 67, we're going to see this in the opposite way because it looks like the Egyptian military operated behind Nasser's back to do certain things that created the crisis in the 67 war. Now, Nasser then looks for weapons from the United States, but there are too many strings attached. So he goes to the Soviet Union, this in 55, and he gets, through Czechoslovakia, a major arms deal that is going to set off an arms race. In the meantime, he has fully blockaded the Suez Canal. He had allowed, to Israeli shipping, he had allowed ships with other flags going to Israel to go through, and he fully blockades the entrance to the Gulf of Aqaba, up to Aqaba and Eilat, which is the Israeli port, into the Red Sea. No Israeli ships can go through there. So this is a stranglehold, although economically not as serious as it was presented, but to the sovereignty of Israel, clearly it's a major affront. So the Israelis are furious, but this is in reaction to all these things that have been going on in 54 and 55. So the Israelis, who already have been getting arms from the French, have another arms deal with the French. And you're building up tensions where Dayan and Ben Gurion, they can't get the cabinet to agree, want to invade Egypt and take over this area, Sharm el-Sheikh, which is now a resort area. You had a horrible terrorist bombing there over a year ago, which controls the entrance to the Straits of Tiran and the Gulf of Aqaba. So other factors come in. We were going, and the British were going to fund an Aswan Dam in Egypt, the building of it. Nasser plays footsie with the Russians to see if they can get a better deal. The British are getting very angry at Nasser because he's, to use the slang, he's an uppity Egyptian. He's a wog. You know, he's not acting with proper respect to the British, and he seems to be interfering in Jordanian politics, which infuriate the British. There are a number of issues causing the Americans and the British to become angry at Nasser. And for John Foster Dulles at the time, one of the major things was that he then recognized as Communist China in May of 56. Because we always fought in the UN at the time, your young listeners here will not know what I'm talking about, to keep Communist China out of the UN as a major victory. Now, Israel recognized Communist China in 1950. See, that didn't matter. When Egypt did it, it was a big deal. So we, in a humiliating way, rejected the Aswan Dam deal in July of 56 and told Nasser's ambassador to go to the Russians. This was in Washington. Nasser, 2 weeks later, on an Egyptian holiday, announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal. You know what I mean? Which technically was going to go over to Egypt in 1968. This is 1956. This causes an immense crisis in which the United States objects to military intervention, which the British and French want. They want to have simply the UN get involved and negotiate. Nasser promises compensation to the company shareholders, the Suez Canal Company, etc. Behind the scenes, the Israelis and the French are using this as a pretext to prepare an attack on Nasser, saying he's a danger to civilization. Nasser now becomes the Hitler, just as Saddam did in 1990. And you have to take him out because he's a threat to world peace. The French are involved with the Israelis. They've been arming the Israelis all along. They're very close. They were those who were encouraging the Israeli nuclear developments at the time. But also the French, you see, were holding on to Algeria. They had just lost in Vietnam in '54. They were going to have to withdraw. They were ultimately going to give up Tunisia and Morocco, which flank Algeria, after not too much nationalist protest. This is an era of decolonization after World War II. But Algeria, they went in 1830, they colonized, they drove the Algerians off the land. They had made this what we call in French, a département of France. It's like a province, it's like a state, like Kansas in the United States. And so it was part of France. You're going to hold on to that. You've got 1 million people, French, Italians over there, etc. Well, you're not going to leave. And you have a civil war that begins in a war against them in 1955, which was commemorated in this film, The Battle of Algiers, which is a classic film. Now, the French were convinced that Nasser, he was supporting them in a propaganda way, but they thought he's sending weapons over there. So if we can get Nasser out, the Algerian revolt will collapse, and we can keep Algeria forever. This was nonsense. But they're siding with the Israelis, and finally they get the British in as of September, and they create a collusion for the Israelis to attack first, and then the British and the French go in, pretending they're separating the combatants, but they're really trying to overthrow Nasser. And this is how the Suez Crisis developed. And even though the Egyptians were taken totally by surprise and were beaten, as like Nasser withdrew his troops from the Sinai when the British and French began to attack, nonetheless, Nasser emerged from this a hero because, in a propaganda way, he stood up to imperialism. See what I mean? And Israel was shown to be, in the Arab view, more emphatically an arm of imperialism. Britain and France, the former colonial masters, etc., etc. Israel gained a great deal out of it because it was able to get the UN to agree that the Sinai would be neutralized and Sharm el-Sheikh, there would not be any blockade. And the Israelis also were able to insist, it was very significant in the UN in March of '57, that if Egypt ever again blockaded Sharm el-Sheikh and stopped shipping, this would be what we call a casus belli, mainly in international law, a legitimate cause for war. And Nasser will do this in May of '67. Now, what's the United States? The British and the French were humiliated, and the Algerian revolt is going to go on. Anthony Eden, who was prime minister, had lied to the House of Commons. His career is over. He has to resign. British imperial power is essentially shattered, certainly in the Mediterranean, and its legacy. But the United States then jumps in. Even though we had opposed this, we then act not with respect to our former position criticizing the attack. We act with respect to Cold War ideas, because the British and the French had allies, in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, even though they were out of there. Jordan, they've been humiliated. We have to step in. We create an Eisenhower Doctrine in January of '57 against anyone supporting communism, seems to intervene in affairs. And you have various attempted coups in Syria, which have been written about by a CIA agent called Wilbur Eveland, Ropes of Sand. He says on one of them, he says, this is one of the most unprofessional CIA operations I ever saw. He writes about driving from Beirut up to Damascus with a suitcase full of money to give the guys to try and overthrow the Syrian government. We did a lot of this at that time. We'd been involved in overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran in 1953 and putting the Shah in after he'd had to flee, the same Shah who gets ousted in 1979 in the Islamic Revolution. This was our attitude. We were doing it in Central America, Guatemala, elsewhere. And we did it in the 80s under Reagan. You get rid of people you don't like and they're socialists. Doesn't matter if the people support them. We want our own people in here. It's an anti-communist thing. What matters to stabilize after this, even though for a couple of years Egypt and the United States had very difficult relations, they seem to improve. But on the Arab-Israeli side, in terms of war, you have very little conflict until 1963-64, when, because of Israeli water operations, you have major clashes with the Syrians. And it's out of this that we begin to get developments leading up to the 67 war, because the Palestinians had begun to organize groups in Kuwait. And they then spread the Fatah, for example, Arafat's group, is founded in 1959 in Kuwait. There are other Arab groups, and they all go to Beirut. Beirut's a pretty freewheeling area. You can publish anything you want. Money's available, etc. And now Fatah under Arafat was a group that wanted to regain Israel. It didn't care about Arab politics. But a lot of these other Arab groups were Arab nationalist groups. The Pan-Arabism was immense at the time. Nasser and the Syrian and Iraqi rulers were at odds over this in terms of who was really the main Arab leader. And a lot of these Palestinian groups were also Pan-Arab groups, which meant that they wanted to have revolutions in the Arab world before you overthrew Israel. See what I mean? So you gain your socialist, Arab nationalist objectives. Arafat and those people could care less about that. You get major tensions developing out of this, and a Arab League conference is called in January '64 because the Syrians have been accusing Nasser, this great Arab leader, of being soft on Israel. You see, Syria and Egypt had united in the United Arab Republic back in '58. The Syrians broke off from it in '61. They resented Egyptian rule. And once they did that, they began under the Ba'ath Party, which is a socialist party, not a Nazi party as the propaganda line goes today. They began to attack Nasser, saying, we, the Syrians, are the true leaders of Arab nationalism. You're a fake. You're a phony. Furthermore, you're afraid of Israel. What are you doing about them, O Gamal? So you're hiding behind these UN groups out in the Sinai. You're saying a lot, but what are you doing? And in order to respond to this, particularly in terms of the Syrian-Israeli exchanges over the water developments in '63, this Arab League conference that Nasser calls creates the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is not intended to do anything except being sort of a rubber stamp for Nasser. Although it does get a little bit out of hand in terms of recruiting. King Hussein throws it out of Jordan, for example. But Fatah and Arafat and these guys are not members of the PLO at that time. They don't really join until '69, after the '67 war. And the Syrians, seeing that the PLO is controlled by Nasser, start to use Arafat and Fatah for raids into Israel. And this leads, with a great deal going on, to major tensions exploding between Israel and Syria, but also with Jordan, because the Syrians send in these groups through Jordan, through the West Bank. And the Israelis, doing their Iron Wall approach, attack the Jordanians, leading Hussein to think they want to overthrow him. He can't figure out what's going on here. Because the Syrians and Jordanians hate each other, and the Syrians want to overthrow King Hussein, and yet when the Syrians do this, the Israelis attack the Jordanians. And Israeli domestic politics come in this, because Levi Eshkol is a very moderate prime minister, and the military thinks he's weak, sort of like Sharet was back in the mid-50s. So in order to show he's tough on the Arabs, he's got to respond to this with major raids, one in Samua, S-A-M-U-A, in the fall of '66. That leads Hussein to think in '67 he's got to align with Nasser, whether he wants to or not, because of what the Israelis seem to intend. So you get all these different factors in domestic politics on all sides coming into this. Well, this really heats up because Nasser protests that he is strong against Israel and the Palestinians, but you really get the major threat in the spring of '67 when things heat up with between Israel and Syria. And the Egyptians are told, and I'll go into a little detail here, the Egyptians are told that the Israelis have threatened, and they have weapons, and they've got an army on the Syrian frontier. They're going to attack. There was no mobilization. Although Rabin and some other people had threatened on Independence Day celebrations in May of '67 to attack the Syrians if they continued this. But nothing had been mobilized. In any case, Nasser either believed this or chose to believe it, which I think, in order to make a show of force, to go into the Sinai, in order to show how tough he was against the Israelis. You know what I mean? And he goes in, and here's where people now think that his generals undermined him. Because we're not sure what might have happened if the UN had said, we're not going to remove our troops, we're going to keep them here. We're going to refer this to the UN. But the generals who went in said, you removed them immediately. And then the UN Secretary General, Utant at the time, of Burmese, said, yeah, if he wants to remove it. The Americans were furious at this, because you could have stalled, you see. Something might have happened.
In 1967, Egypt, allied with Syria and heavily armed by the Soviets, moved its forces close to Israel's border and closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping. But Israel launched a massive preemptive airstrike which decimated the Egyptian and Syrian forces. Armed with the latest American and French weapons, Israel forced the Egyptians to retreat and completely overran the West Bank, setting themselves up in occupation over all of Greater Israel, including Jerusalem. Thus, the Zionist dream of dominion over all of the ancient Jewish kingdom seemed to be fulfilled.
Well, when we look at the 1967 war, we have so many different issues here, and the reality is quite different in many ways from what has been presented. There's no question that Nasser went into the Sinai, and that ultimately, rather quickly, the UN people were forced to leave, and this included from Sharm el-Sheikh. And at this point, the Israeli army was mobilized, including all the reservists, and this can hurt the economy over a period of a couple of weeks, obviously, and it's a crisis situation. And there's also no question that Egyptian propaganda was talking about throwing the Jews into the sea, avenging the Palestinians, etc., etc. So all of that propaganda was being beamed into Israel. And Israelis were horrified and saw this as a major threat, obviously, to their security. On the other hand, Nasser, once he went into Sharm el-Sheikh, didn't blockade, you say. He was aware of what had gone on in '57 when Golda Meir and the UN had said, this will be a casus belli. And then he's mocked, not only by the Syrians, you see, his major Arab nationalist rivals, but also by Hussein of Jordan, who hates Syria. They're both calling him a coward for not blockading, you see, the Straits of Tiran and closing off the Gulf of Aqaba. And there's a whole propaganda war going on between these Arab states that are the three Arab states that are going to be involved in the 1967 war. It's a crazy situation. Now, once he does that, of course, you technically have a justification for Israel to attack, but Israel doesn't. The United States has gotten involved, and there's a lot of effort to try and build up international support to open things up. And as this goes on, and there's major consultation between the Israelis and Washington, the Lyndon Johnson administration, Israelis keep coming in, and what happens is they ultimately get reassurances behind the scenes that we will not object if they attack. There is a crisis in Israel because Eshkol is seen as very weak, and had been seen as weak before, and so he had brought Moshe Dayan back in, the hero of the Sinai campaign in '56, as his Minister of Defense, and then he allowed Menachem Begin in as Minister without portfolio, the revisionist leader, whom Ben-Gurion had despised. Ben-Gurion's now out of politics. And this is a major victory for the revisionists, this legitimacy that they have. But even then, the votes are tied, and Eshkol is hesitating, and there apparently is almost a military revolt at one point, because they want to attack. You see, regardless of what the Israeli public understandably thought in terms of all these threats and what had been going on, the Israeli military saw this as a great opportunity, because they knew they could beat all three armies. And the CIA told them, yeah, you can do this, there's no problem. So, and they wanted to defeat and destroy the armies and wreck all their armor, all Soviet-supplied armor in the case of the Soviets, the Syrians and the Egyptians. So the military was champing at the bit, and Eshkol was holding back. And there were some terrible meetings that went on, which the public at that time did not know about. Well, in the meantime, an American businessman who was operating for the Americans had talked to Nasser. And a deal was made for an Egyptian vice president, Zakaria Mohyeddin, to come to Washington on the 7th of June to talk about a withdrawal. In other words, things would be diffused. And it was hard to claim that the Egyptians, although they had violated this whole thing about the Sharm el-Sheikh and blockade, that they were really intending to attack, because it did not really seem that their troops were in offensive positions ready to go. As a matter of fact, when the Israelis finally attacked on June 5th, they were all stood down. There was nothing really going on. The deal to have this Egyptian come was June 2nd. The Israelis were informed on June 3rd. And the advance delegation for the Egyptians was arriving June 5th. Now, as I said, Israel had a justification to attack. But they had hesitated. But their decision to attack was made after they learned that the Egyptians were coming. In other words, it was not because they were afraid of an imminent Egyptian attack. It was because they were afraid and feared that the Egyptians would get away with something, creating a crisis and withdraw, and the Israelis would not have done anything about it because of this deal that would be made. And that really is what caused them to attack, to make the decision to attack. And this stuff is still getting misrepresented. There's a major volume out, The Foreign Relations of the United States, on the 1967 war. The State Department just put it out, which gives you all the details. But a man named Richard Haas, who was in the Clinton administration, just had an article in Foreign Policy trying to show that he is an alternative to the Bush administration, still supports regime change. But he uses the 67 war in some ways and says Israel attacked because of an imminent danger from Egypt. Totally false. Had there been a danger at the end of May, could you say that this was? Absolutely. But when you finally decided to attack, you knew that the Egyptians were looking for a way out. And of course it was a debacle. And the Jordanians had stupidly taken Egyptian leadership. They allowed Egyptians to come in. The deployments had been changed. They fought very well. I talked to some Israelis who fought in that war, and they admired them and the way the Syrians fought when you took the Golan Heights. But there was a tremendous amount of effort on all sides then. The Israelis just swept through. They were able to take Jerusalem, which they then annexed to Israel, and the West Bank. And then later on, they took the Golan Heights. And of course, the West Bank and the Golan are still Israeli today. The Sinai was returned as a result of the 73 war and then negotiations that occurred at that time following that. Now, the 67 war had a tremendous impact in many, many ways. It's not just territory. It devastated Nasser. He lived on to 1970, but his reputation had declined. And he had been a hero of Arab nationalism, and the Egyptians had idolized him. And in Egypt, this is going to cause the beginning of a shift towards Islam, towards religion, because socialism has proved bankrupt, and the Egyptian state economy is a joke under Nasser. And what do we have? And we've been destroyed, our army. The Israelis are on the Suez Canal. You see what I mean? And the canal, by the way, will be blocked for 8 years until 75. Which the United States doesn't matter because we're in Vietnam, and this means the Russian supplies through the Black Sea can't go through the Suez Canal. They got to go all the way around Africa. So that's fine. Leave this canal closed. Not only is religion going to be very important there, but when Anwar Sadat succeeds Nasser, he's very fearful of the left-wingers who were allied with Nasser. So he begins to encourage the Muslim Brotherhood to become more public, to gain Islamic sentiment backing him against his leftist enemies, you see. So Islam then is going to become more of an issue in Egyptian politics. At the same time, in Israel, it's not strictly religious, but the fact that you've taken over what had been part of ancient Israel means that even many secular Israelis see this in a historic way, and want to settle there. This doesn't happen all at once. But there is this beginning of a movement that then becomes much more mobilized with Gush Emanim, 1973-74, and illegal settlements being allowed. You turn a blind eye and they can be set up and all this other thing. In the meantime, the Israelis had promised that they would negotiate and withdraw for nearly all the territory. But they informed the United States after the war that that wasn't necessarily going to be the case. On the other hand, their stand was that the Arabs would have to negotiate with them directly, not through the UN. And a great deal of what is going to go on in the early 70s is going to have to do with the UN and certain politicians in the Nixon administration, the Secretary of State, pushing for international involvement, William Rogers, whereas Kissinger and Nixon are sabotaging the UN and letting Israel know through the back door they don't have to worry about it. And Israel is in the Sinai, and they begin to build air bases there and things like that. They immediately begin to settle in the Golan Heights, and a man who does that is a man named Yigal Allon, who was seen as a moderate, but he was elected from northern Israel, and a lot of his constituency want to settle on the Golan Heights. This is democracy at work, you see. So the West Bank is the trickiest issue, and what are you going to do about that? Gradually, but slowly, but gradually, you're going to begin to have settlements there, even under Yitzhak Rabin when he's prime minister in the mid-70s, and then once Begin comes in, it's going to explode from 77 onwards. So we're looking at this, and how are you going to resolve this situation where Israel is in control of these territories? Sadat comes in, and Sadat really wants to settle things. He makes all sorts of overtures where he wants full return of the Sinai in return for peace, which the Israelis don't really want. They want to control some of the Sinai. The Israelis finally decide that if they can get a deal with Egypt, that would help, because then they could isolate Egypt and deal with the Jordanians and the Syrians without worrying about the Egyptians, who have the biggest army. It's not to settle things and make peace, it's to have more control over those areas. But in the meantime, things are developing where Saddam and the Egyptians have thought, and Assad is in power of Syria, they've been pleading with the United States, look, we want to get something going here. And the key here was Security Council Resolution 242, which was very ambiguous, because it said that all nations should be able to live in peace and secure boundaries. It also said that no country should be able to keep territory acquired by war, you see. And it said that Israel should withdraw from territories taken in the recent conflict. Now, the word "the" was left out before "the territory." So Israel was not required to withdraw from the territories, just territories. Israel said it would not agree to UN Security Council Resolution 242 if "the" was in there, although it's in the French and Russian versions, because that would mean all the territories. They wanted to keep some territory. Why? Because other parts of 242 said all countries can live in secure and recognized boundaries, and we can't be secure in what we had, so we're going to have to keep some more territory. See what I mean? So we'll have to keep some. Now, what occurs here, again, domestic politics come in. From the beginning of 73, Egypt and Syria are preparing for an attack at some point, if the Nixon administration isn't going to get involved. Domestic politics, Nixon has Watergate. He's not paying any attention. Kissinger is running the country. The U.S. isn't going to do anything, even though the Egyptians in 72 threw out the Soviets, which the Americans wanted as a Cold War victory. Okay, so nothing's going to happen on that front. You prepare for this, you say. Would you have attacked? Who knows? But you have an election coming up in Israel. And Moshe Dayan is this very mercurial person who's been part of the labor coalition. And he says to Golda Meir, I'm going to go over to the opposition unless you agree that there's something in our platform that says we are going to keep almost half the Sinai Peninsula, we're going to annex it, as well as begin really pushing settlements in the West Bank. And if you can envision this in terms of the Sinai, which you'd have to do with a map, you come down from the northeast corner of the Sinai and Gaza and come down to the middle central area and then come over. So you're taking the eastern part all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, Sharm el-Sheikh, and the bottom of the Sinai, and then you come over to half of the western part. And the reason you're doing that is that the Egyptians had discovered oil there and have been using it, and the Israelis have been taking that oil illegally, contrary to conventions, but they want to annex that too. So this becomes part of the Labour Party platform, which an Israeli politician at the time, Pinhas Sapir, says, this is stupid. This is domestic politics, but this should have nothing to do with this. What would be next, you say? So you have the attack, which is a major victory initially. The Syrians almost regained all of the Golan Heights, not quite. The Israelis fought back valiantly and successfully and finally held them off. The Egyptians stormed across the canal, which Diane had been saying in the election campaign in the fall of '73, we have the superiority for the next 10 years, the Arabs can't do anything. This shattered his career. Even though finally the Israelis win and they finally wind up coming over on the western side of the canal, they're in territorial Egypt, this is going to be settled. There's serious fighting, and I have Israeli friends who were fighting in Suez, and they admired the Egyptians. The Egyptians really fought well in this war. They avenged '67, even though they didn't win outright. The Israelis wanted to drive the Egyptians out of the Sinai Peninsula and put the status quo back in before the attack. But the Americans intervened and said, no, this is a negotiating chance, you see. The Israelis didn't like it. But then Henry Kissinger becomes the star, and he does his shuttle diplomacy when he's not going out with movie stars in Hollywood. And you have these disengagements that are beginning to take place. 2 with Egypt, '74, '75, and 1 with Syria on a goal line in '74. And this is what was called a step-by-step process, whereby the idea is that you are ultimately going to create trust. They're called confidence-building measures. No confidence was ever built with these. This was a fiasco. But it was this idea of incremental steps that ultimately lead to negotiations. Well, after the second Egyptian-Israeli deal, Assad is furious in Syria because he wasn't consulted. And it's clear to everybody that Sadat wants a private deal. He's sick of Egyptian blood being spilled. He wants the Americans to come in. And if he agrees to peace with Israel, and he's already been opening up the economy, you see, to foreign investment to try and get the U.S. on his side, he thinks he can have a separate peace and his economy will develop. So he lets the Israelis know, to everyone's astonishment, that he's willing to go to Jerusalem, etc. And you begin to have negotiations, although it takes a very long time for them to get off the ground. The Israelis are very eager to have this because, as I've said before, they don't want peace in the entire Middle East. They want to be able to impose their will vis-a-vis the West Bank, Jordan, and Syria. And if you can get Egypt out of the way, great. See, you don't have to worry about that plank. And ultimately, after much conflict, Sadat and Begin, who by this time despise each other, with their advisors, come to Camp David in 1978, and at the last gasp minute make an agreement that translates into the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty of March of '79 and the exchange of ambassadors, etc. And the Israelis agreed that they will withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula in 3 stages, the last one being in April of '82, and I was in Israel when that happened. So you have a peace treaty with an Arab state until 1994. See, but once this happens, the Israeli attitude under Begin, who's the prime minister, and who's committed to this total thing about keeping Judea and Samaria, the idea was, and this was the slogan, the Sinai has been lost, but Eretz Israel has been won, meaning Eretz Israel, the integral ancient Israel, including the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. We're going to keep this forever, no matter what people think. Forget Security Council Resolution 242, forget the whole thing. And this begins to lead then, after 1978, particularly in '79, the peace treaty, to this enormous settlement process that begins to go in the West Bank. Under Likud supervision, particularly Ariel Sharon. And the intensity of this, and it's very carefully planned, and you deliberately put settlements up against Palestinian Arab communities and take their land by saying it doesn't belong to them, etc. And the Reagan administration is very pro-Israeli because of the Cold War and things of this sort. And with respect to what's going on in Nicaragua, you know, and the Sandinistas, and we're pushing these Contras who are committing terrorist acts to killing civilians. Not only are the Israelis involved in this, but the Saudis are involved in this in terms of funding it. Saudis are funding this, and they're funding the Afghanistan Mujahideen as well, with our advice in Afghanistan. See, this is an anti-communist crusade in Afghanistan and in Central America, and the Iran-Contra thing where you're selling missiles to the Iranians, and the money will then go to fund, some of it will go to fund this as well in Central America. This is all part of the deal at that time. And a lot of these people who were convicted of lying and of crimes, who were then pardoned by the first President Bush, are in this Bush administration right now. Now, once you get this going on, what is going to happen? The Palestinians are increasingly coming under stress in many more people, and this is ultimately going to lead to the first Intifada. And you're getting many more settlers coming in, militant settlers. Now, the Israelis are also pushing this: nice homes, low mortgages. You know, you can commute to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv in half an hour. You get all these new roads being put in, bypass roads, etc., so you don't have to see any Palestinians. This goes on all through the 90s as well. But this does lead to the first Intifada, an uprising that is relatively weapons-free. Stones, yes, but very, very few weapons. Totally in contrast to, and the Israelis more or less observe the rules. In other words, when they use these rubber-coated bullets, they shoot at the legs. They don't shoot at the heads. They don't file down the rubber-coated bullets as they do in 2001, in the second Intifada. So, and the Intifada really resurrects Arafat, you see, but it also enables Hamas and groups like this, who the Israelis have encouraged to grow as Islamic groups against nationalist groups, to deflect attention from, divert attention from Arafat. That was a pretty dumb thing. Now they're all united together. Ultimately, the Israelis crush the Intifada in 1990-91, but thanks to Saddam Hussein, with whom we've been very close during the 80s, he invades Kuwait, and we decided to create a coalition to drive him out, first Gulf War. We want an Arab coalition because we don't want to just go in on Saudi territory, the sacred Islamic territory, where Mecca and Medina are. So we get Egypt and Syria to go along. And what do they say? Okay, we'll do it, but you've got to resurrect the Palestinian track here. You see, the Intifada has been crushed, many more settlements going in. You've got to do something. And the Bush administration, James Baker, the Secretary of State, agreed. So after you have, you know, the first Iraq War, drive them out of Kuwait, the Iraqis out of Kuwait, then you have the Madrid conferences and exchanges that go on here, 91 to 93. They don't really lead anywhere. But in the territories, which are the occupied territories, you're beginning to get much more resistance now by Hamas, because Arafat, who has supported Saddam, has been shown to be a dupe, you see, and he's lost all his funding from the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, who have been giving him most of the money, and he supports Saddam Hussein, who then attacks him. So that's great logic. So he doesn't seem to be doing anything to oppose further Israeli settlements. Hamas is, and they're gaining more support. Once the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, essentially forces an election and opposes Yitzhak Shamir, the Israeli prime minister, who is resisting negotiations, they support Rabin coming in as prime minister. And Rabin and Peres finally decide to resurrect Arafat. Because if they can resurrect Arafat as the Palestinian leader, then maybe this will mute Hamas's appeal to Palestinians, and you'll have less resistance. See? That's how the whole Oslo process gets going. And you ultimately have the Oslo Accords of 93, and then you have the second one of 95, which is going to lead to Rabin's assassination by this Israeli terrorist. Now, let me summarize very briefly what happened with the Oslo Accords. First of all, Arafat and the Palestinians recognized the right of Israel to exist. Rabin and Israel did not recognize any Palestinian state. That never came about until 2001, 2002. What they did was recognize that the PLO was the spokesman of the organization of the Palestinians. But technically they could stop talking to them at any time, while in fact the Palestinians, represented by Arafat, had recognized Israel's right to exist. And many Palestinians were infuriated by this, not because they didn't want a two-state solution, they did, but simply because you'd given the farm away in terms of recognition and you hadn't got very much back. The Israelis had controlled all the cards. And so this leads to a situation where from 93 and then even after Oslo II and 95, from 1993 down to the 2000 negotiations and the Intifada that breaks out, settlements double in the territories, particularly in the West Bank, during this peace process. See? So we can do what we want, but the Palestinians cannot resist. If they resist, this is terrorism, but we have a right to establish as many settlements as we want. And so you get the even greater takeover of land for bypass roads, immense roads, new settlements, etc., etc. With Arafat, apparently, acquiescing in this as part of the peace process. What is the peace process getting you from the Palestinian point of view? Not very much. But ultimately, after the disastrous Netanyahu prime ministership, Ehud Barak comes in 1999 as prime minister. And he's a liberal, he's a labor person, he's a military hero, he's dynamic. At one point he says, in response to a question, if I had grown up Palestinian of my generation, I probably would have been a terrorist. Well, should they do? Look at what has happened to them, you see? But Israeli politics was so fragmented by this time that when he created his coalition, he had to introduce parties that totally opposed any peace with the Palestinians. And the National Religious Party, he gave the housing ministry to them. So in Barak's prime ministership, before the Camp David talks in July of 2000, settlements increased at a more rapid rate under Barak than they had under Netanyahu. See what I mean? And all the time, Clinton is trying to create a negotiating mode, you know, for talks, which are ultimately going to be a disaster. But Barak backed off. Barak didn't really make offers. He never put anything in writing. He refused to talk to Arafat during the meeting. He always had Clinton make the offers. And if he didn't like what Clinton did, he could say, I don't agree with that. You see, but saying, I want further changes. So if Arafat said, well, I'll get back to you, but right now it doesn't look very good, the Palestinians, and there was this constant propaganda machine coming out about how the Palestinians were rejectionists, but this does not mean that the Israelis were that forthcoming at all. Now, in the end, with Clinton, you did have major breakthroughs. There were offers that were made that were very attractive. And Barak did go much further, certainly, than anything that had been done before. But he initially offered 66% of the land, with the Israelis to keep, 10% and another 14% for 20 years or more. Now, and this was a non-starter. Ultimately, through Clinton, not through Barak, you do get agreements on Jerusalem and a division up into Jewish and Arab sectors of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, in Israel, Sharon is mobilizing support against all of this, to undermine it. And keep in mind that Sharon and Netanyahu had talked at demonstrations against Rabin in the summer of '95, where you had posters that called for Rabin's assassination. He had swastika, he was in the scope of the sniper, etc. Now, they say they never called for this. It's true they didn't, but they certainly were at major demonstrations where this stuff took place. Sharon is trying in Israel to totally undermine any of the talks that are going on. On that issue, there was really no agreement.
Thank you for watching. Your support really does help this channel grow. Please don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment.